Okay, so today we are going to talk about the Renaissance in music. This is the second half of part two of the book, the second chapter of part two. It's our second musical era to get into. And this also will conclude part two of the book. So we will have our exam on Friday. Okay, so the part two exam is on Friday. You need to make sure that you've done those two multiple choice assignments. They're 25 questions or so apiece. So it's all 50 of the questions from the test into those two assignments. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you've got those done, that you're ready to go for that exam on Friday. The assignments are also all due on Friday. Then the exam, if you're going to take it at home, if you're not going to do it in class with us, that'll be due on Monday morning at 8 a.m. Okay, so you'll want to get that done. This afternoon, I'll go ahead and make part three available for those of you that have finished with part two and are ready to go ahead and move on. I know some of you guys like to go ahead and get that stuff done. Part three is a 2-week unit, so it's going to be a little bit longer. And I did divide up the assignments. So some of the assignments are due at the end of next week, and the rest of them will be due the week after that. Okay, so make sure you're paying attention to those due dates. And like always, there is kind of an explanation paragraph to tell you exactly when everything's due. And then that exam will be 2 weeks from today. Okay. If you have any questions about that stuff, please let me know. Your grades have been updated, including going through and putting in anything that's not been turned in that was already due has been turned into a 0. So what I need you to do at this point is if you turn something in late, you need to shoot me an email and let me know that you've turned it in late, because I'll have to go back. It won't automatically give you the grade. I have to go back and fix that. So especially for the exam, that's a big chunk of your grade. So if you want to get credit for that, if you've not done it yet, make sure that you let me know that you've done it late so I can go back and get that done. And I think in this class, there were still like 4 or 5 people that have not taken it. Okay. Do remember that you can only take the exams late 3 different times throughout the semester. All right. There's 6 exams total. So you don't want to put every exam off by a week, because after 3 times, I'm not going to let you do it anymore. Okay, and that's just to make sure that you're not just giving yourself an extra week for every single exam. Okay, so if you're somebody that took those late, just remember that as we go through. Okay, you can go ahead and have assignment 2.2 open today. We'll cover most of the stuff from that assignment in class today, and if you have any questions, of course, you can always email me and let me know. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen again. Also, just for attendance purposes, those of you that are joining us online, to be counted as present, you do have to stay for the class. I just noticed that pretty much as soon as I was taking roll, somebody ducked out, and he did the same thing last class period. So you will not be counted present if you leave the session right after I take roll and don't come back. Now, I understand that internet connections some of you have to kind of come back and go back and forth a little bit, but you can't just leave after I take roll and expect to be counted as here. It would be just like if you came to class and as soon as I took roll, you got up and left. I'm not going to count you as present for that, just so you're aware. And also, of course, the recording will be made available. You can find those under lecture videos in under course materials for each part. Okay, so on Monday we did a quick and dirty run through of the Middle Ages. So that leads us up to about 1450 AD, and that gets us into the next section. So that first 1,000 years of music history, the Middle Ages that we talk about, we don't know just a whole lot about the music that was going on there, okay? What we listened to and what we've studied was just a small part of what was probably going on. We don't know everything, but I can only talk to you about the stuff we do know. So understand that there was probably other music happening during that time. We just don't have a lot of record of it. All right, we're pretty sure that everything in the church was Gregorian chant, and we're pretty sure that the other music that was happening sounded pretty similar to the instrumental music that we listened to, but there's no way to know that for sure. Okay, the Renaissance, we do start to get some better records, so we have a better idea of what was going on. And as we get into the Baroque era next week, you'll notice that there's a lot more composers and a lot more individual pieces of music that we'll be listening to, because the information does become more readily available to us. Okay, so this tells you a little bit about what was going on in the Renaissance. During this time, the big thing that I want to talk about as it relates to music is education. In the Middle Ages, education was pretty much relegated to the churches. The priests, the monks, they were the only people that could read or write or were educated at all, and therefore that's where most of the music was coming from, at least up until the 12th, 13th century or so, when it did start to become a little bit more fashionable. In the Renaissance, throughout Europe, the aristocracy, the rich people of Europe, decided that education was important, and they wanted to be more educated. They wanted to show their status by being better musicians. So as we start to look individually at music, we see that music becomes a lot more important to everyday life during the Renaissance. Life gets a little bit better for the lower classes. The idea of being peasants kind of starts to go away during the Renaissance. We do start to see a middle class develop during this time period, and that leads to more music being performed. More people are becoming educated and learning how to play instruments and learning how to dance and to read music, and that really kind of takes over in Renaissance lifestyle. Music becomes a huge part of the everyday life during the Renaissance. The printing press is invented during this time, and that has a huge impact on music as well, and that's one of the reasons why this period is so much shorter. The first section that we looked at, the Middle Ages, was 1,000 years. The Renaissance is only about 150 years, from about 1450 to 1600. Now, I don't think I mentioned this before, so I'm going to go ahead and mention it. When we talk about these eras and the time periods that they cover, it's important to understand that these are not hard and fast lines. These are approximations, okay? It's not like somebody woke up on January 1st of 1450 and said, we're in the Renaissance now, and everything changed all at once. Okay, these were gradual shifts that happened throughout Europe, and these aren't just in music, they happen in the art world, in the literature world. Anytime you look through history, you kind of see these divisions, these same divisions, although the dates may be a little bit different. Musically, we say that from around 1450 to around 1600, music was in this new Renaissance style. That's not to say that Gregorian chant didn't exist anymore. It's not like music goes extinct. It gets added onto. But the majority of the music that we're hearing that was performed in the Renaissance was in this style, okay? You'll notice that some of these composers, some of the music that is written actually has dates beyond the Renaissance era into the Baroque era, but that's just because there were some prominent composers that were still writing in the Renaissance style, even as we get into the next era of music, and we want to go ahead and include them in this section. Okay, so the printing press has a big deal in music, is a huge deal in music, because we can print music and we can send it all over the world. We have these new notation systems that were developed in the 14th century, and we've kind of standardized what sheet music looks like. So now you can have a publisher can take a song that's written by anybody and can print it and print multiple copies of it and send it all over Europe, and it can then be performed all over Europe. And that's very popular during this time. It's why we start to see more composers that are recognized by name in the Renaissance, because people see, oh, this person wrote this piece of music. Well, I like that piece of music. Let's buy more of the music that they wrote. And we start to see the development of publishers and things like that during this time. The church is still important in music, but it is not the most important music during this time. There is still a lot of stuff going on. The church choirs grow in size. They're still primarily male choirs, except for in the abbeys where nuns were singing. But we do see more parts being added and larger compositions for church music, and we're going to listen to a few of those in a minute. We also see musical activity shift into the courts. So the aristocracy, what used to be the nobility, they still have these kingdoms, and they still have these courts where their castle is, and they've got a whole bunch of people that live and work within that castle all the time. And music becomes an important part of that daily life. You have musicians performing at dinner. You have, if the princess wants to take a stroll in the garden, you'll have a group of musicians in the garden playing for that. If some prince is coming to try to win the hand of the princess, then you're going to have musicians there performing for that celebration. So there's a lot of music happening in the courts. If you think about all those Disney movies, you always see groups of musicians performing in the castles. All right, that was a big part of music during that time period, during the Renaissance era. And those composers were working for the courts during that time. You would have a court composer that was employed by the nobility, and it was a pretty sweet gig to have because you would be treated as on equal terms. They were still technically servants, but they were treated very well, and they were well respected because everybody wanted to be a trained musician. So you would hire somebody to come and teach the princess and the queen and the king, and there were emperors even that wanted to learn how to play music. And that goes on for a few hundred years. That's one of the reasons Mozart was so popular, is because the emperor of Austria employed him to be a composer for Austria. So this is going on heavily in the Renaissance. Musicians are getting paid very well. They're enjoying higher status. They're being recognized as the artists that they are during this time. We do see from this time forward, we're going to have these cities and countries that are spotlights for musical developments throughout music history. And in the Renaissance, Italy is where everything was happening in music. All of the major advancements in music in the Renaissance came out of Italy. And most of the composers that we're going to look at are Italian composers or composers that were working in Italy during this time, like Gabrieli that we just talked about in the daily listening. Some characteristics of Renaissance music. For each of the styles, for each era that we go through, we'll talk about some of these characteristics, what kind of makes this music sound like Renaissance music. So that when you hear music, you can kind of get an idea, oh, that sounds like Renaissance or Baroque or classical or Romantic style music, because they are all very different. So Renaissance music, vocal music is still more prominent than instrumental music during this time. They use a lot of word painting, which you read about when you talked about Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And word painting is where the music itself kind of follows the lyrics. And we're going to look at some examples of that in just a minute, where you'll see composers that if they say the word descending in the lyrics, then the melody is going to descend, is going to go down the notes. If they say ascending, the melody is going to go up. And there are some composers that use this a little more overtly or a little bit more subtly sometimes than others. We do have a lot of emotion being expressed in Renaissance music. Typically, it is an entire piece of music has one emotional characteristic. That's something we're going to see shift in the Baroque era. We're going to start to see one piece go through different emotional contrasts. But in the Renaissance, it's still, if it's a happy song, the whole song is happy. If it's a sad song, the whole song is sad. And we're going to listen to some very melancholic music at the end of the class today. Texturally, most Renaissance music, as I mentioned earlier, is polyphonic, although we do see a little bit of homophonic as well. Polyphony becomes very popular during this time, especially imitative polyphony, meaning that you have different lines going on that are repeating the same thing that a previous line did, just at different times. If you've ever sung a round, if you've ever sung Row, Row, Row Your Boat in round, that is imitative polyphony, where one person starts with row, row, row your boat, and then the next person comes in with row, row, row your boat, while the other person is singing something else. That's imitative polyphony. And we're going to hear that in these first couple of pieces we're going to listen to here in a second. We do hear that our style of harmonic writing starts to shift in the Renaissance, you may have noticed that that Gabriele piece sounded a lot more like modern music than the Middle Ages music did. We start to hear more traditional chords, major and minor chords like we see today, although we still see the church modes used quite a bit, and we haven't fully developed the harmonic language that's common today. That's coming in the Baroque era and in the Renaissance era, or in the classical era. But in the Renaissance, we're starting to make our way there. We're starting to get closer to modern harmonic sensibilities. A cappella music becomes very popular. A cappella is an Italian term that basically means unaccompanied choral music. Okay, you've heard of a cappella groups. Pentatonix kind of made that idea popular after the show, The Sing Off. These a cappella groups, they're very popular. They're all over the place. There's some great YouTube videos of some really wonderful a cappella groups. And I kind of talked earlier in the semester about why a cappella music sounds so magical, and we're going to hear a little bit of that today. Rhythmically and melodically, we're still, we don't necessarily have the steady drive and rhythm that we're going to hear in the Baroque era or that you have in modern music. We do have a steady tempo, but it still has kind of a gentle flow rather than these sharply defined beats that we're going to hear a little bit later. Our melodic lines start to gain some greater independence. Those polyphonic melodies are starting to move rhythmically on their own and do some more interesting things on their own. And we start to see the melodies during this time are still kind of like with Gregorian chant. They're following fairly stepwise motion. They start to move along a scale with a few leaps here and there, but nothing too extreme. It's still very singable music during this time. Okay, so in the sacred music world, we have two types of works that become very popular during this time: the motet and the mass. And the motet in music is a polyphonic choral work, Renaissance in style, usually that's very short. It's a shorter individual piece of music. Okay, that's the big difference between a motet and a mass. A mass is a larger scale piece of music that's made up of a bunch of different parts, usually 5 different parts, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a motet stands alone. It's by itself. It does sometimes use the Latin text, but we also see some vernacular text, meaning that we'll start to see Italian thrown in there, or we'll see French thrown in there along with the traditional Latin text that we were hearing in the Gregorian chants. Okay? One of the great composers of the Renaissance motets was Josquin de Prix. Typically, you hear him just referred to as Josquin. He lived in Italy and worked in Italy for most of his life. And the piece that we're going to listen to is Josquin's Ave Maria, Virgo Serena. Now, there are a ton of Ave Marias out there. They're very, very popular pieces of music. Some of them show up in movies. I think the video game Hitman uses an Ave Maria as one of its main themes. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's this one. So that's why this one is specifically has the subtitle Virgo Serena, which means the Serene Virgin. So this is a 4-voice motet, meaning that there are 4 different vocal parts. I believe that's a question on the listening guide for it. It is primarily polyphonic, although it does have a little bit of homophony as well. And the melody, it uses this imitative polyphony where the melody overlaps and creates this continuous flow throughout. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. The melody kind of passes from voice to voice here. And I want to look in the textbook. You can kind of see in the sheet music how this works. So even if you're not comfortable reading sheet music, you should be able to kind of get an idea of what's going on here. So you have 4 parts: the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass part. And up on the top, the sopranos start with this. That's the main theme of the beginning, the Ave Maria theme. And then you hear the altos, before that one finishes, the altos come in with the same theme an octave down. So it sounds like this. Nope, shit, messed that up. We'll try again. So it's the same idea, just happening in layers. And then before the alto finishes, the tenor comes in. And before the tenor finishes, the alto comes in. It's all the same notes in different octaves, but it's the melody being passed from voice to voice. And that really gives this its characteristic sound. And that really happens throughout. You can see this next theme that comes in, the, Gracia Plena, that happens here. It's again the same movement happening in all the different voices being passed around. So let's listen. We'll listen to a little bit of it at least. Here's voice 3. Here's voice 4. Do you hear how that melody is being passed around from voice to voice? And then at the end of that phrase, did you hear how it all kind of came together in one final chord, and then it moved on to the next section? So that's another defining characteristic of Renaissance music, right? So that kind of gives you an idea of what the motets would have sounded like. They're all pretty similar to that. They're these polyphonic, short choral works. Along with the motets, we also have the development of the mass in music. Okay, now mass you hear as kind of the generic term for a Catholic church service, right? Musically, a mass is a piece of music that follows that same liturgy. All right, they consist of 5 different parts that are commonly used throughout the Roman Catholic church services: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. So it's every musical mass is going to have those 5 parts in order, right? So if you look up, for example, we're going to listen to Palestrina's Kyrie. If you just looked up Kyrie on YouTube, you're going to find 1,000 different pieces of music because all these composers wrote masses. In fact, Palestrina himself wrote 104 masses. So even if you look up Palestrina Kyrie, there's 104 possibilities that are going to show up. Okay, now this one is the most popular, so it might be the top one that you find, but make sure that you specifically include that this is from the Pope Marcellus Mass if you're going to look it up, or you can just click on the link that I provided for you. So this is a mass, again, is a polyphonic choral composition like the motet, but it's made up of these different parts. We don't need to worry about this Council of Trent nonsense here. So Palestrina is a very, very prominent composer of the Renaissance, centered in Rome. Again, we're in Italy, where these developments are happening. And as you can imagine, being centered in Rome, he was writing a lot of music for the Catholic Church. He wrote 104 masses, as I said, and he also wrote about 450 other sacred works. So motets and some other solo works for primarily voices. There were a few instrumental pieces in there as well. The Pope Marcellus Mass is a mass that's made up of 6 voices. So he's expanded that a little bit here. And again, we're heavily using imitation, much like Josquin did with his motet. This is a little bit later. This was written in about 1562, so towards the end of the Renaissance, but it is still very much in that Renaissance Mass style. So this is the Kyrie from the Pope Marcellus Mass. And I'll show you in the textbook, again, they've got some of the sheet music. to kind of show you the melody there that again gets passed along. I love Renaissance vocal music. I think this is some of the most beautiful music that we're going to listen to during this class. So notice, by the way, that the Kyrie consists of 6 total words: Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, and Kyrie eleison repeated, which means Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. And those are repeated over and over and over again. So it starts with the word Kyrie, and you're going to hear that word over and over and over for about the first minute, and then it'll finally say eleison at the end of that. Isn't that nice? Really pretty stuff there. And did you notice that resolution at the end? We had kind of a tense chord that held on for a minute, and then it resolved on the word son right at the end of that phrase. This really nice moment where the music kind of breaks and releases us for just a second before it goes back into the polyphonic style. That's one of the reasons why I love Renaissance music so much, is that you have all this complex stuff happening, and it just builds and builds and builds and builds, and then finally you get this nice little release. It's good stuff. Okay, so that's what's going on in the church, and I want to close today in these last 10 minutes or so talking about the secular music that's going on. Again, vocal music is... there's really primarily vocal music. There is some instrumental music that's talked about in the book. We're not going to listen to it today because it's really pretty similar to what you heard with the medieval music. It's primarily dance music. But vocally, there's 2 trends that are happening that are both very important. We have the madrigal and we have the Renaissance lute song. And these are being performed outside of church. Everybody, educated people during the Renaissance were expected to know how to play and sing music. You're expected to be able to read music and also be able to dance. It was just part of the everyday life of an educated person. So the madrigal is one of these types of vocal pieces that was popular. It started around 1520 in Italy. And this is kind of a dramatic piece of music. It's going to be set for several voices for a choir of some kind, but with each voice kind of having their own part to sing. And it's usually set to some kind of poem, a love song, or an adventure, or mythology, or something like that. It tells a story of some kind. So it is a dramatic work, and they tend to combine the homophonic and the polyphonic texture. And they use a lot of word painting and some harmonies that are a little bit unusual for us to listen to. And I'm going to go ahead and listen to, actually, we'll just go ahead and talk about the Renaissance lute song. The other style is the Renaissance lute song. So the lute is an instrument. It looks like this. You've got a painting of it here. It's kind of a predecessor to the guitar. And this was a very popular instrument during the Renaissance. People just had them in their houses. I mean, how many of you have a guitar at home or at your parents' house? Okay, several of you, right? The lute was the same way in the Renaissance. People just had them. It was a very common instrument. And these Renaissance lute songs were kind of the folk songs of the day. They were songs that people would write specifically for lute and for voice. And they became very popular because, again, it is the chordal accompaniment on the lute with the melody being sung. It is homophonic in texture. So we're going to listen to a couple of pieces here. The first one is from Thomas Weelkes, who is an English madrigalist. When I ask you what kind of composer was Weelkes, he was a madrigalist. And we're going to listen to his piece, As Vesper Was Descending, which is technically written after the Renaissance era, but it's in the Renaissance style. And this is from one of his madrigals entitled The Triumphs of Oriana, and it uses a lot of word painting and a lot of overt word painting. So we're going to look at the sheet music while we're listening to this, and I want you to see if you can spot some of those times where it uses this word painting. As Vesper was to whom I had a star, came running down the road, first 2 by 2, first 2 by 2, then 3 by 3, then 3 by 3 together, leaving their goddess all alone. All right, so let's talk about some of the word painting in here. What do you notice musically here at the beginning when they say the word descending? What's happening to the music? The notes are moving down, right? And then when we say the word ascending, the notes go back up. Okay? How about this little section right here? Listen. Right? Came running down the main. You can almost see, especially with the way that he scattered the music out, you can almost see a hill with all these different people running down it while they're singing, running down a main. That's that word painting. And then probably my favorite part of this, which is at the time would have been super clever. Today it's almost a little bit corny. When it says first 2 by 2, how many voices are singing? 2. And that repeats. How many voices sing 3 by 3? 3, right? And notice what happens on the word all alone. Did you catch that? It says all alone, you have that one single voice singing all alone, right? So again, that's that word painting that was super popular during this time. Something you may have noticed, it actually took when we got to all alone the first time for me to notice it the first time I listened to this. Did you notice that these are all male voices? That there's some of that top high voice are men singing very high. That was another common part of this Renaissance madrigal. In fact, a lot of times, the men singing the women's parts would have actually been dressed in women's clothing. It was kind of part of the comedy of the whole thing. We know that Shakespeare used a lot of that as well in Shakespeare plays. This is all Renaissance stuff, right? In fact, sometimes it was even more entertaining that they would be men dressed in women's clothing that still had like beards and stuff. So it was very obvious that it was men dressed in women's clothing, but it was all part of the show of this thing. Okay, and lastly, before we dismiss today, I want to listen to John Dowland's Flow My Tears. So John Dowland is one of the first rock stars, right? Even his painting, he looks like a rock star, right? He's got his guitar, his lute, and it's like all dark, and half his face is hidden in shadow. So he was a composer of lute songs during the Renaissance and was a very popular one. This tune, Flow My Tears, is one of his most popular pieces. Written for lute and voice, it is a homophonic song with the lute accompanying the vocal melody, and it is a very melancholic piece of music. It expresses melancholy, which is very prominent during Shakespeare's time, during Renaissance music. If you think about like Romeo and Juliet is a very melancholic tragedy, right? So we're going to listen to this to close us off today, and you can get kind of an idea of these very melancholic lute songs. So pretty melancholy stuff, right? Happy are those who are in hell because they don't feel the words despite. Ooh, right? Yeah.
What's the difference between guitar and the lute?
A lute is kind of a predecessor to the guitar. They had anywhere between like 8 and 25 strings. It's closer to like a 12-string guitar. They were in courses where you would have two close together. But it is a pretty similar type instrument. In fact, a lot of times when you hear singers do this in college, they usually get a classical guitar player to accompany them because they're a lot more common. Although lutes are becoming more popular again in classical music. People are studying that Renaissance style. Good question.
Where do you like learn to play a lute?
You can buy them. You can actually get them on Amazon for a couple $100. And some of them are kits that you put together yourself. It's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I spend my money on synthesizers these days. But yeah, they are. You can find them and get a lute book and watch YouTube videos. And if you really want some interesting lute stuff, look up a Thorbo. It's a bass lute. It has like a 9-foot tall neck on it. They're crazy. Yeah, they're awesome. All right, guys, thank you very much. If you have any questions, stick around. Otherwise, I will see you on Friday for the exam. Online folks, if you have any questions, I will be here to answer for a few minutes.